The envelope crinkled in my hand like a bad punchline. Yellow manila, cheap as hell, sitting between the lobster canapes and the custom-etched champagne flutes. Elise handed it to me like it was a favor. "This is yours," she said, all smiles, perfectly framed by the firm's gold and marble logo gleaming behind her like a throne she'd apparently built solo. Laughter rippled across the rooftop, donors, partners, influencers, all toasting her journey. I looked down, divorce papers. She'd slipped a pen inside like she expected me to sign it between courses. "We've outgrown each other," she whispered, lips barely moving, like she was giving me a stage direction. I didn't say a word, just placed my champagne glass on the polished table, careful not to spill. I read the first 3 lines, then flipped to the signature page and signed. Not because I was defeated, not because I was stunned, but because I already knew where the funding came from, knew what clause she forgot existed in that neat little prenup she skimmed once between yoga and a board call, knew what happens when you underestimate the man who built the scaffolding under your spotlight. The photographer caught my exit. Of course he did. Elise had hired him for candids, the kind that go viral in legal magazines, but that wasn't the photo that would make headlines. It would be the one taken 5 minutes later, Elise holding a champagne flute, grinning like she'd won a war, oblivious that her victory party was held on my dime and on my countdown. So yeah, I left. Didn't make a scene, didn't smash a glass or shout some poetic line. That would have given her what she wanted, drama. No, I gave her silence, the kind that seeps into a room after the music stops. Look, if you've ever given everything to someone, money, time, peace of mind, only to be handed your own name back like a receipt, you get it. And if you're still with me, consider subscribing. More than 97% of folks listening never do, and trust me, your support makes a bigger difference than you think. It keeps the stories flowing and the team fueled. Thanks. Back to the rooftop. Her friends laughed. Some nodded sympathetically, like she'd just done the responsible thing, like divorcing a man who held her back was a natural next step after launching your own boutique law firm. The same firm, mind you, that she once called our shared dream, the one that couldn't have happened without my quiet funding, strategic connections, and one particularly well-timed exit package I negotiated behind closed doors with a company she thought she'd beaten on merit. That's the part people don't see, the backstage crew. Elise was always front-facing, polished, brilliant with clients, but she didn't know how to build infrastructure. She couldn't read a term sheet without help. She once asked me if a burn rate was a medical condition, but I stayed quiet for 17 years, because love's not always loud, until it ends with an envelope. After I left, I took the private elevator down, didn't even loosen my tie. The valet handed me my keys with a sheepish, "Rough night, sir?" I smiled. Not yet. What Elise didn't know was simple. This wasn't a reaction. This was a reveal. She'd mistaken the silence for weakness, the support for servitude, the shared home, shared trust, shared roadmap, for submission. I didn't just walk out of her party. I walked into mine. By the time the string quartet packed up their instruments and the rooftop bar started rinsing champagne flutes, Elise was still glowing, still basking in the attention. The party had gone exactly how she envisioned. Photos, press coverage, a few buzzed investors throwing around words like visionary and game changer. She gave the same rehearsed line to every compliment. "It took a village," then paused, smiled. But the vision was always mine. Meanwhile, down on the 37th floor, the real village was unraveling. At 11:08 p.m., the first wire transfer bounced. It wasn't small, 1.7 million, earmarked for a new client acquisition suite and 2 senior lateral hires from a rival firm. Elise's newly appointed COO, Brandon, handpicked from a finance startup because he used words like runway and leverage in every sentence, saw the failed transaction on his dashboard. He assumed it was a timing error. Tried again. Bounced. The second transfer, $4.2 million for marketing spend, expansion, and a new PR firm Elise had been gushing about, crashed next. Authorization error. That was the message, not insufficient funds, not account blocked, just authorization error. Brandon checked the sender, Stratwell Capital Group LLC. That's when his stomach dropped. Stratwell wasn't some big bank. It wasn't a venture fund or a private equity titan. It was the umbrella name Thomas had registered 6 years ago, an obscure LLC buried under layers of legal insulation. Brandon hadn't thought much of it. Elise called it her angel group, said Thomas helped line up a few old friends from his Wall Street days to get the firm off the ground. No one questioned it. No one asked who wired the money, only that it arrived on time, every quarter, until it didn't. Brandon pinged Elise, who was still upstairs taking post-party selfies with a lifestyle blogger. One of the investor accounts is throwing errors. Looks like Stratwell flagged us for review. Elise laughed, literally laughed, and typed back, probably their internal system glitching. Thomas always said their bank was ancient, except Stratwell was the bank. At 11:51 p.m., Brandon hit refresh on the internal dashboard. A new red banner blinked across the top. Primary funding source, flagged for termination, review pending. He froze, tried to trace the authorization path. All roads led back to one digital signature, T.S. Whitaker, Thomas. That's when the COO did something rare. He called, not emailed, not texted, he called. Elise picked up on the second ring, still buzzed off VOOV and validation. Bran, it's late, you okay? Did you know Stratwell is Thomas? His voice cracked slightly. Not just connected, it is him, it's a shell. He funded everything himself. She laughed again. That's absurd. Stratwell was his friend's firm, Peter or Philip or… Elise, Brandon cut in, whispering now like the line itself had ears. I ran a full audit. Peter Marshall was an alias. The domain registrar traces back to a P.O. box in Ridgefield. That box is registered to you, from 6 years ago. He set this whole thing up through your own trust. We just never looked close enough. Silence. Then, you're overreacting. No, Brandon said. I'm not reacting enough. At midnight, Elise pulled up the internal report on her iPad. Her login wouldn't load. Access error. She tried again. Invalid credentials. That's when she stopped smiling. Somewhere in the server logs, a timestamp read, revocation initiated. 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. She still thought it was temporary. A glitch. Some petty flare-up he'd undo in the morning after a few drinks and a guilt trip. What she didn't realize was that nothing was broken. It was working exactly as designed. By 12:47 a.m., Elise was barefoot in her office, still in her gown, the straps slipping off one shoulder, pacing in small, violent circles around the black marble desk she had once chosen together with Thomas, back when she thought aesthetics matter more than legacy. The gold-plated stylus he gave her as a launch gift sat in the corner, untouched. She dialed again. Voicemail, again. Voicemail, again. Hi, you've reached Thomas Whitaker. Please leave a message. She didn't, not once. She just kept redialing like that would somehow will him into answering, as if repetition could replace relevance. The night air was colder now. The windows gave a perfect view of the skyline she thought she owned, but the glass reflected something else. Her face, and behind it, a different kind of ruin. Not external, internal, structural. Her first real panic didn't come until she opened the banking dashboard on her iPad. Their joint high-yield account cleared, 0 balance, transaction history, transfer completed to Crescent Holdings. She didn't recognize the name, so she clicked. The registration address led back to a Delaware holding company. She tried to dig deeper, but her access had been revoked at 11:59 p.m., that exact timestamp again. She turned to their property management portal next. The lake house, the one in Vermont. Gone. Title transferred to North Axis Development. She clicked through and found the signature. Thomas S. Whitaker. No cosigner. Next, the brokerage firm they'd both used for years, the one where she kept her passive investments, mostly ignored since law school. She logged in. Access denied. She tried the forgot password link, entered her email. Email not recognized. It was like she'd been erased from her own life, like the man she dismissed as just the husband had known exactly how to walk backward through every door they'd ever entered together, shutting each one behind him. Her new CFO, a wiry man with a tech startup past and a habit of wearing sneakers to board meetings, entered the room quietly. I thought, he said barely above a whisper, I thought he was just the husband. Elise didn't answer, just stared at the frozen screen in front of her like it had personally betrayed her. Her nails, once manicured to perfection, were digging crescents into her palm. She tried texting this time. We need to talk. No response. Please, I didn't know. Nothing. You're overreacting. Let's fix this like adults. Still nothing. The silence was unbearable, but it was familiar. It was the same silence she'd served him for years, dismissing his questions, brushing off his concerns, minimizing his input. When he wanted to discuss succession planning for her firm, she told him to stay in his lane. When he suggested she renegotiate with the real estate developer for their HQ lease, she laughed and said, You're not my advisor. No, he was more than that. He was the foundation. and she had just tried to evict him from the empire he built. Now she finally understood why he didn't scream, or fight, or beg, because men like Thomas don't beg, they restructure. She opened the internal directory to find someone, anyone, who might know more. Names started disappearing as she watched, as if her own firm's infrastructure was ghosting her in real time. The phone slipped from her fingers, landed on the floor with a dull clack. She bent down slowly, shaking, and picked it back up. 1:09 a.m., still no missed call from him, only one open notification. Your two-factor authentication settings were recently updated. Not by her. The morning sun hit her office windows like a cruel joke, light flooding a battlefield. Elise hadn't slept. Her dress was still crumpled around her waist, hair pinned in a half-collapsed updo, mascara smudged in faint rivulets under both eyes. No one knocked, no one dared. She was alone finally in the building she thought she ruled, until her phone buzzed at 7:42 a.m., a call from Greg, her longtime lawyer, old school, overly cautious, expensive as hell. She almost didn't answer, but something in her gut said she couldn't afford not to. Elise, he said, voice dry, we spoke to the trust officer this morning, the one overseeing the Stratwell umbrella. We needed clarity on the funding source and lien release. Good, she interrupted, grabbing a coffee-stained napkin to jot notes on. This is just some clerical thing, right? Something we can threaten with a court order? Silence. Then Greg's voice dropped. They're invoking Clause 7.3 of the Marital Asset Agreement. Her hand stopped moving. The pen tip dug into the napkin until it tore through. Clause what? Page 6 of the prenup, Greg said carefully. Thomas's lawyer filed a procedural notice to initiate a reversion claim on all jointly held investments, citing the clause about reputational damage in the case of public humiliation, specifically the language you both signed under section. Wait, she snapped. That was theoretical. That clause was a joke. He added it because he was worried about headlines, remember? I signed it because you said it was symbolic. Greg cleared his throat. It's not symbolic now. It's executed. The clause has teeth. If the reversion is tied to demonstrable public embarrassment, which, given the footage from last night, it absolutely is, then every account, investment, and property linked to both names defaults to the original financier. He was the financier, Elise muttered. Exactly. For the first time in 17 years, Elise couldn't speak. She reached for the drawer in her desk, second from the top, behind an old stapler, and yanked out the prenup, a thin, neat stack bound with a fading blue ribbon. She hadn't touched it in years, thought about it even less. Back then, Thomas had insisted on keeping things clean. She had joked he was being dramatic. He said, "It's not about now, it's about when things get weird." They were officially weird. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages. There it was. Clause 7.3. In the event of reputational damage caused through deliberate public actions, including humiliation, degradation, or defamation of the spouse, the party responsible forfeits claim to all shared investments, and said holdings revert to the original financier upon execution of a signed divorce petition. Below that, highlighted in yellow, in her own handwriting, LOL, like this would ever matter. She stared at it so long her vision blurred, and then, almost absurdly, she started laughing. Softly at first, then bitterly, until it curved into something closer to a sob. Her assistant poked her head in, alarmed. Elise waved her off like swatting at smoke. She whispered, he knew. He built this for this exact moment, and he had waited, patiently, silently, while she dismissed him, while she talked over him in investor meetings, scoffed at his suggestions for hiring a second compliance officer, ignored every quiet warning masked as marital concern. Thomas had never been controlling. That would have been easier to hate. He'd been prepared. Elise grabbed her phone, pulled up the footage from the rooftop party. There it was, her handing him the envelope, the glint of camera flashes, her saying the words, "We've outgrown each other." A crowd of colleagues laughing behind her like it was all performance. And now, it was evidence. Clause 7.3 wasn't just enforceable, it had already been enforced. She looked around the office again, at the walls she once called her cathedral, and realized she didn't even own the bricks. The buzz that followed the launch party lasted exactly 36 hours. Then it curdled. Internally, it began with silence, calls unreturned, meetings rescheduled indefinitely, calendar invites vanishing like breath off glass. Externally, it came as whispers, which in a legal community like theirs might as well be broadcast alerts. Elise knew how fast narrative spreads when lawyers smell blood. One leak, one comment, and your power mutates into risk. By Wednesday morning, one of her co-founders, Madeline Green, former equity partner at Carver and Doyle, was gone. No press release, no farewell memo, just a 3-line exit statement filed with HR and a deactivated email account. Elise tried calling, straight to voicemail. Later that afternoon, a text thread leaked to legal subreddits. It showed an anonymous investor, tagged only as Angel B, pulling funding. One line stood out, circled in red by whoever shared it. Why is everything tied to him? That was the moment Elise realized the damage wasn't technical, it was narrative. Her firm's DNA, once sold as female-led, future-driven, now read like a side project propped up by a quietly dominant husband. And worse, one who had vanished mid-performance, pulling his name and the floorboards. On Thursday, she entered the office at 6:12 a.m., before the staff, before the noise. She walked the halls barefoot, coffee in hand, like she was trying to reclaim something invisible. The startup aesthetic she once celebrated, glass doors, exposed beams, breakout nooks, suddenly felt too open, too easy for people to disappear from. Her assistant Rachel was already at her desk when Elise passed by. That struck her as odd. Rachel was never early. "Morning," Elise said, pausing. Rachel flinched, startled. She covered something with a folder. Too slow. Elise raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "A beat. Just redoing some signage for next week's sponsor rollout." "Let me see it." Reluctantly, Rachel pulled the folder back. It was a mock-up of the firm's new brochure for upcoming conferences. The front panel used to say, Elise Langford, Managing Partner. It now read, Board of Trustees. Her name was nowhere. "What the hell is this?" Rachel panicked. I didn't change it. This came from upstairs. Marketing. They said to use the trustee language from now on until the funding restructure's complete." "There is no restructure." Rachel didn't answer. She just looked down, and for the first time since joining the firm, avoided eye contact. Elise stormed to her office, slammed the door, and opened the internal Slack channels. Hash Ops was dead, Hash Legal News was filled with articles she hadn't approved, and Hash Admin Requests had a message pinned at the top. All branded materials must reflect interim governance structure per Monday's board memo. Use trustee-led label until further notice. Do not list individual partners unless instructed. No signature, no name, but everyone knew who orchestrated it. She reached for her phone again. Still no message from Thomas. Not even a breadcrumb. And that, more than anything, made her want to scream. If he had gloated, cursed, demanded anything, she could fight it. But this was cold, calculated, corporate. Her empire was being rewritten in real time, and she wasn't being pushed out. She was being scrubbed. By the next morning, her executive assistant was reassigned to shared partner support. Her head of PR went on temporary sabbatical, and her co-founder, Daniel Soto, the last one still publicly aligned with her, requested a private meeting. He didn't show up. Instead, he left a note with reception. "This isn't sustainable. My family advised I step away. No hard feelings, just business." Elise didn't cry. Couldn't. Something inside her had calcified. But she did pull up the original branding proposal Thomas had mocked up 5 years ago, back when the firm was still an idea scratched into a linen napkin during their anniversary dinner. Lexbridge. That was the name he wanted. Neutral, scalable, timeless. She'd insisted it needed her name. Elise Langford and Company, now the End Company, was all that remained, and even that was dissolving. Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. Elise stood at the head of the conference table in the boardroom she once called her war room, the same space where just weeks ago she delivered a TED-style pitch to a room full of angel investors about female-led disruption in the legal industry. Now the energy was off. The chairs felt colder. The blinds were drawn. Only 4 of the 7 board members showed up in person. 2 dialed in with cameras off. 1 didn't even bother. She had rehearsed her speech that morning, down to the breaths. A 10-minute defense of her leadership, followed by a forward-looking plan for stability and recovery. She even had a mock-up of the new advisory committee structure. A pivot, but salvageable. That was the bet. What she didn't account for was the man sitting 3 chairs down from her usual seat. He wasn't on the invite, wasn't on the board. Yet no one asked him to leave. He introduced himself as Darren Clark, senior counsel at Vargas and Hume. He spoke softly, flat affect, like a therapist reading a toxicology report. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Thomas Whitaker," he said without glancing up, then calmly opened his leather folder and slid several documents across the table, one to each board member. the final copy landing directly in front of Elise. Per the original seed investment agreement, he began, and in accordance with the provisions outlined in Addendum C, this is formal notice of intention to withdraw all remaining investor funds under the 72-hour liquidity clause. Elise didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at the title. Notice of Strategic Withdrawal, Stratwell Capital, Lexbridge Funding Agreement. Her fingers twitched. That clause doesn't exist, she said finally. Her voice sounded distant, small. Darren offered a faint smile. Not in the original draft. Addendum C was appended during the final notary review. Page 82, Section 6. You initialed it. I have the time-stamped video file if you'd like to review. The room was silent, the kind of silence that implies people knew this was coming and had simply chosen not to tell her. She flipped through the pages, scanning for the clause like a drowning woman looking for shore. There it was, buried in polite legalese. In the event that the seed investor, through direct or proxy capacity, determines that ongoing association with the firm poses undue reputational, ethical, or financial risk, investor reserves the right to initiate full withdrawal of capital and suspend all support services with a 72-hour execution window. She remembered the night she signed that version. Thomas had ordered takeout, brought wine, told her to take her time. She skimmed it, half distracted, asked, "Is any of this different?" He'd smiled and said, "Mostly cleanup." Cleanup indeed. "What happens if we challenge this?" she said, not to Darren, but to the room. No one answered, not even the CFO, who sat rigid, pale, his tablet untouched. Darren leaned back. "The funds are already in transition. This meeting is courtesy, not consultation." She wanted to scream. Instead, she sat down slowly. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "He planned this." Darren didn't nod. He didn't need to. By noon, Elise's executive access to the Treasury portal was revoked. At 1:43 p.m., the finance team received a memo from Stratwell confirming execution of the withdrawal order. By 3 p.m., over $20 million in capital support was gone, redirected through 3 silent accounts, each registered to separate holding companies, each with Thomas's name on the originating chain, not overtly, but unmistakably. Worse than the money, though, was what followed at 3:17 p.m., an updated press contact list sent to all firm PR liaisons. Under media inquiries spokesperson, her name was absent, just one line at the bottom, pending trustee confirmation. At 4:26 p.m., she sat alone in the war room, lights off. All that remained on the table was the empty folder Darren had left behind. Inside the spine, someone had written one sentence in fountain pen. "Next time, read the addendum." The studio lights were soft, warm, deliberately flattering, the kind meant to smooth out tension lines and cast CEOs as calm, collected visionaries. Elise sat in the center of a minimalist set, surrounded by soft gray paneling and a tastefully curated fern someone had probably misted 30 seconds before cameras rolled. She wore a navy blazer with a crisp white blouse, understated earrings, and the faintest glimmer of foundation masking a week of sleepless nights. On screen, it worked. Off screen, she was unraveling molecule by molecule. The setup was simple, a 10-minute segment on modern women in law airing on a local morning show, a puff piece, hand-picked and brokered by her PR firm, one of the few vendors who hadn't yet ghosted her. The producer called it reputation stabilization, a gentle reframe for the narrative collapse underway. Elise agreed because she needed one win, just one moment where she could look like she was still holding the wheel. The first few questions were harmless, safe, practiced. "Tell us what inspired the founding of Langford Legal?" "Well," Elise smiled, "it was really about independence, about building something from scratch with the kind of integrity and innovation that big firms sometimes lose sight of." "Some say you've redefined the boutique model. What's next for the firm?" "We're expanding, cautiously but with clarity. The last few weeks have shown us where we need to reinforce our foundation." She said the word foundation carefully, knowing it would trigger something in herself. She kept her smile tight. The interviewer, a woman named Kara, maybe late 20s, overly enthusiastic, flipped to a new card. "And how would you respond to the recent rumors about financial restructuring?" Elise leaned in. "We remain fully operational. These kinds of transitions are normal when a firm evolves as fast as we have. Our clients continue to receive the same elite service. Nothing changes there." Kara nodded, but her next smile wasn't as friendly. "One last thing," she said casually, flipping her final card face down. "Just something our viewers have been asking." Elise tensed. Is it true, Kara said, pausing for effect, that your ex-husband was your firm's majority silent investor? The pause that followed could have swallowed a whole city block. The PR manager behind the camera shifted in his seat. Someone coughed. Elise blinked once, slowly, like her brain had to buffer the question before rejecting it. I don't think that's relevant, she said, voice suddenly thinner. But is it true? Kara asked again, polite but pressing. Because public records now show that Stratwell Capital, your primary investor, was controlled entirely by Thomas Whitaker. And people are wondering, if the funding came from him, did you really build it alone? Elise didn't answer. She stood up mid-question, removed her mic, and walked off set without a word. The camera kept rolling. The shot of her back turned, walking briskly past the fern and out of frame, was later clipped and shared more times than the interview itself. She thought they'd cut it. They didn't. By 7:03 p.m., the segment aired unedited on local television. By 8:19, it had been clipped, subtitled, and uploaded to multiple legal gossip accounts on Instagram and TikTok. By 9 o'clock, the firm's name was trending on Twitter, not for any legal victory, not for her expansion, not for her polished interviews from the past, but for one line. Did you really build it alone? That was the question she'd tried to bury. That was the question that now refused to die, and suddenly, everyone had an opinion. Classic grift, use the guy's money, then drop him for optics. She walked out because she couldn't lie on camera. Why scrub the name from press kits if there's nothing to hide? The story had mutated. It wasn't about her accomplishments anymore. It was about the ghost in the foundation, the quiet man in the photos she used to crop out, the financier with no name, now with all the leverage. Her internal Slack lit up with "We need to talk" messages. The HR channel issued a reminder, do not speak to press. Her PR firm stopped returning calls altogether, and her inbox flooded with media inquiries titled only, "Clarification Request, Mr. Whitaker's Role." Control was gone. Now, the story wasn't hers. It was his. It arrived in a white envelope, hand-delivered. No email, no phone call. Just a folded letter with her name in embossed serif. The kind of thing someone sends when they want to ensure there's no room for misinterpretation. Elise opened it in her office, alone, still clutching a lukewarm espresso she hadn't sipped since morning. Effective immediately, I am resigning as your legal counsel, citing a conflict of interest related to recent disclosures. Signed, Richard H. Lennox, ESQ. She blinked, then read it again. Richard had been with her since day one, long before Langford Legal had offices or clients or even a logo. He was the one who reviewed her first retainer agreements, helped draft her operating structure, and sat beside her the night she signed the lease for their flagship location. He never missed a filing deadline, never took a vacation during a litigation cycle, and knew every skeleton in her closet, including the financial ones she'd buried under shared marital assets. She texted, "Rich? What conflict? This can't be serious." No response. She called, straight to voicemail. 3 hours later, the firm's internal directory marked his profile as archived. Her assistant said nothing, just hovered in the doorway like she'd been rehearsing excuses for a week and suddenly realized none of them would work. The next day, Elise tried spinning it. "Richard's stepping back for health reasons," she said in a call with one of the trustees. "No bad blood." It was a lie, but not the worst one she'd told lately. What she didn't expect was how fast the footage would spread. 3 nights later, at a high-profile charity gala for legal tech scholarships, one Elise had donated to for years, a news outlet posted a clip on their socials. It showed Thomas arriving alone in a charcoal 3-piece suit, looking less like a jilted ex and more like a man arriving for the closing bell at a stock exchange he quietly ran. Beside him, Richard Lennox, smiling, laughing, shaking hands. The caption read, "Thomas Whitaker appears with new legal rep at Beacon Foundation Gala. Sources confirm Lennox now advises Stratwell Holdings." Elise didn't breathe for a full 5 seconds. She watched the clip on loop. In the footage, Richard turns to say something to Thomas, casual, familiar. Then Thomas pats him on the back like they've done this 1,000 times. There was no tension, no hesitation, just alignment. Perfect, practiced alignment. It was a level of coordination that took time. He hadn't just poached Richard in a fit of revenge. He had courted him, gradually, quietly, while Elise was too busy curating her image and filtering out inconvenient voices. The next morning, internal firm chat channels buzzed again. Someone posted a screen cap of the clip in the #legal news thread with one line underneath. The firm's founding lawyer, now with the founding funder. She deleted it immediately, but the damage wasn't digital. It was structural, because Richard was more than legal muscle. He was a symbol, he was continuity, and now he was walking proof that her strongest relationships were no longer hers. Elise tried to explain it away during her weekly call with her remaining partners. Richard and I had different visions. It was mutual. Silence. Then Daniel, the only board member still speaking to her directly, said quietly, "You didn't even know he'd left, Elise." The line echoed, not just in the room, but in her mind. She thought Thomas left the night of the rooftop. He didn't. He just changed venues, from shadows to strategy, from support to siege, and he brought her lawyer with him. It was a Monday, always a Monday. The office was quieter than usual, a vacuum of sound that no conference calls or clacking heels dared interrupt. Elise arrived at 7:18 a.m., early, deliberate, controlled. She wore gray, not her usual bold power red or midnight blue, just gray, somewhere between surrender and camouflage. Her assistant wasn't at her desk, no coffee waiting, no schedule printed, just an unopened manila envelope placed dead center on Elise's glass desktop, perfectly squared. No return address, no logo, just her name in tight, formal block letters. She didn't open it right away. She circled the room first, turned on her monitors, stared at her wall of framed awards and glowing plaques. They felt obsolete now, paper tombstones. Then she sat and opened the envelope. Inside was a single document, 12 pages long, clipped neatly at the top. The first page was all she needed to see. Shareholder restructuring notice, effective immediately. Her eyes flicked down the body of the letter, catching only fragments. Voted in favor of revised governance protocol. CEO retains ceremonial title. Operational authority suspended pending board ratification. Voting rights reassigned per Article 5, Section 3. She flipped to the last page. 11 signatures, every remaining board member, and one final one in dark blue ink standing alone beneath them all, not typed but signed by hand. Thomas S. Whitaker right below it, in a steady, deliberate scrawl. Built in silence, removed in silence. For a moment, Elise didn't move. Then she slowly folded the document shut, as if it had weight, more than paper, heavier than steel. She didn't cry, not yet. The tears were there, pressed against her throat, but they were too proud to fall. Instead, she stood, crossed the office, and opened the blinds fully. The skyline was the same, cold, metallic, unforgiving. She tried logging into the internal dashboard. Access denied. She tried dialing the boardroom extension. No answer. She called HR. Voicemail. When she tried messaging her assistant, the Slack reply came automatically. "I no longer work at Langford Legal. Please contact General Operations." The chair behind her desk was suddenly foreign, too high, too rigid, like it belonged to someone else now. Because it did. The titles were still there. CEO, founder, visionary. But they were just costumes now, hung over a mannequin everyone had stopped dressing. Elise sank back into the chair and stared at the envelope again. It wasn't revenge. That's what haunted her most. There was no gloating, no smear campaign, no PR ambush or public teardown, just surgical, systemic replacement with her own blueprints. She once told a magazine that she'd never need to look over her shoulder because she only ever looked forward. Turns out she should have looked down at the man who stood behind her for 17 years, the man she publicly dismissed with a champagne toast and a manila envelope, the man who let her bask in spotlight while he quietly controlled the electricity. She looked at the signed line again, built in silence, removed in silence. It wasn't a threat, it was a eulogy. 2:17 a.m. Her phone lit up against the dark, casting pale blue shadows across the edge of her nightstand. Elise had stopped silencing notifications days ago, like a gambler waiting for one last hand. She'd started keeping it face up on the pillow next to her, as if proximity might summon closure. Maybe a second chance, maybe just an explanation. Call #457, missed, no voicemail, just the number. One more attempt in a long, unanswered procession of digital pleading. She stared at it, barely breathing. Then the screen lit again. Not a call, a message, from Thomas. It was just one line. "You never understood who built your empire, but I did." She read it once, then again, and again. Each word peeled something off her that she'd spent years gluing on. Her fingers went limp. The phone slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. She didn't move to pick it up, just sat on the edge of her bed, frozen in a silence that wasn't peaceful, just total. the kind of silence that doesn't soothe but swallows. Outside, the wind was shifting. Somewhere down the block, construction crews worked by floodlight, their drills humming in short, angry bursts, replacing signage. They'd said the new branding would go up tonight, quietly, no ceremony, no press release. She rose slowly, crossed the room, and parted the curtain with the edge of her hand. From her penthouse window, she could see the roof of her firm's headquarters. Workers moved like ants, precise, faceless. The gold-lettered signage that once screamed Elise and Company had been stripped clean, letters gone, base scraped. In their place, the new name glinted under halogen work lights.